I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. Welcome to episode 151 of the Naked Mormonism podcast. Today is a little bit of a different take. We're not on our regular historical timeline. Instead, what you're about to listen to is a presentation that I gave for a local ex-Mormon meetup group in St. George. This is the Southern Utah Mormon-ish support group. You're going to find a link to it in the show notes to their Facebook page anyway. And I just want to let you guys know, I give these talks from time to time, and they're really fun and really engaging, and the group here was really awesome. And I, of course, want to thank them, as well as Wayne Hepworth, for coordinating this and for getting together, and for sitting and listening to me for the hour and about an hour and 20 minutes that you're going to listen to this. So without further ado, let's go ahead and kick on over to that presentation. So, first off, I want to thank everybody for coming out. This is really cool. Thank you for inviting me. I don't know what set of events transpired that got Wayne to reach out to me to invite me to this, but whoever is responsible for that, from the bottom of my heart, I really do thank you. More importantly, I want to thank everybody for coming out and being a member of a post-Mormon community. Right? So, like, we grow up in the church, we are raised in it, we spend a lot of time in it. It provides a community. The church provides a lot of good things. It also comes with a lot of bad things, a lot of baggage, a lot of things that we have to deal with outside of the church. And when we leave that, we leave it behind, and there's a vacuum of community. And it takes effort, it takes time, it takes energy to come out to a group like this. And for that, thank you. Thank you for being a part of a post-Mormon community and trying to build that infrastructure that exists beyond faith in the church. Because that's where the real work happens. So today I have about 18 pages of notes to get through. I like to over-prepare instead of under-prepare. We can go a couple of ways with this. I actually have three possible options here of what I can discuss or what I can present on today. And I figure we can just put it to a vote. Yeah? Let's do a little common consent here. So I've come up with three possibilities, right? So option number one, I can tell my story. A lot of people like to hear that. Maybe some of you are here to hear my story. But for some people, you've already heard my story in appearances on my podcasts, on whatever, and you maybe don't want to hear it again. So, that's totally cool. And also, people really like to talk about themselves, and I can talk about myself forever. So, but you'll all get really bored really quickly. So that's option number one. Option number two, I can present what I find to be most interesting in Mormon history after studying it for 5 short years. I'm still a baby in the community of Mormon history, but after studying it for as long as I have, I've come away with different understandings of church history than I did when I first started studying it. So option number two is just bullet points of what I find to be interesting in Mormon history. Option number three, I can present my newest research on psychedelics and early Mormonism. I hear laughter, scoffing, but you might be surprised actually how interesting it can be. So why don't we take a vote? Okay, so all those in favor of hearing my story, option one, please manifest it. All three? All three? All right, a hybridized system of it. Okay, so we're going with the opposed votes, apparently. And I'll do my best to get through all of the material I prepared. Strap in, everybody. So I was born and raised here, not in St. George, in Bountiful, Utah, actually. And I lived here my entire life. I did all of the typical stuff that kids do growing up in the church, baptized, deacon, teacher, priest, so on and so forth. I have one older sister, and that's my only sibling, and she actually started having problems with the church and going to church long before I did. So she I like to say she blazed the trail, having the fights with my parents, pulling herself out of the church that I never had to have. So when I came along at 16, 17 years old and told my parents, hey, I don't want to go to church anymore, they just said, okay. Anybody else have that good of an experience? Little chuckles, laughter. Yeah, so I've led a really charmed life in the church and out of the church, really. I haven't really had to deal with a lot of hardships. I never went on a mission. I never went through the temple. I never checked all of the boxes that I assume a lot of people in this room have. So I don't understand a lot of what it's like to grow up and spend your young adulthood in the church and to go to singles ward and to go to BYU and to, marry in the church and to raise a family in the church. I've never had to understand that. I've never had to do that myself. So I can't speak to what those experiences are like, which is why I love coming to groups like this and talking to people who have gone through those things, because then I get my eyes open to a world that was planned for me that I chose an alternate path away from. And that's just something that I constantly have to wrestle with. So I did everything that I was supposed to, though. Got my Eagle Scout. I did all the requirements for my duty to God, but because at the same time that I was supposed to get the duty to God, I was having problems with the church and not wanting to go anymore, I left one requirement undone and didn't graduate with duty to God. So that was my own personal protest. I'm not going to get it. I'm not doing my duty to God anymore. Also going through high school, I experienced, I assume a lot of people have at some point in their life, a lot of depression and anxiety, a lot of problems. And I was very lucky to have parents who were very in tune with it and, people who were surrounded me that were very caring and helped me to find the help that I needed. And I was able to overcome those old feelings of depression and anxiety through a proper treatment regimen. And that's something that I'm a strong advocate for. If you're struggling with any feelings of depression or trauma or anything to that effect, especially after leaving the church and leaving an entire community and a lot of your friends and family behind, it's important to find the help that is out there, the help that we need in order to grow and develop as holistic human beings. So I was very lucky to find a proper set that got me over that spell in my life. And I spent my, late teenage years overcoming those feelings. So I graduated high school, graduated seminary. Against my will, I didn't want to go to seminary. I wanted to use that time in seminary instead of going to release time. I wanted to use it for actually going to a real class, but that wasn't an option. But I did graduate seminary, and then I went to 1 year of college at Weber State University for computer science. And then I entered the workforce. So that is my entire background education, high school degree, and dropped out of college. I'm also a millennial. So I've grown up in the information age. Before I had a double-digit age, we had a computer with internet in my home. And that has been my teacher for a long time, for most of my life, is whenever I have a question, the information is always there right at my fingertips. I don't have to search very far for it, which is something that I think a lot of people in my generation really take for granted. We don't understand that when I'm reading a book like No Man Knows My History, Fawn Brodie, published in 1945, she didn't have the internet, right? She had to go through archives and pilfer through filing cabinets and find all these documents. She had to go to libraries who had newspaper archives to collect information in order to compile it in the book. But that information now can be collected in a weekend for us. It's incredible, the amount of information that's out there. So that has been my university. We'd sometimes call it YouTube University. But also at this time, as I'm getting older, as I'm entering the workforce, I'm feeling really directionless. Not sure really what I want to do with my life. I'm working at a job that is very physically taxing. It was a delivery job that was, really hard on my body. And I didn't like my job very much. I didn't like what I was doing, and I couldn't see myself in a career in it. Possibly in a career of driving trucks, because that's a career, but also looming in the future for millennials, self-driving cars are going to be a thing. Self-driving trucks are going to be a thing, and truck drivers are going to be out of a job. So that didn't seem like it was a reasonable career path to go into. So I had to find direction. I had to find what I wanted to do with my life. So I eventually, as I was driving my delivery truck through Salt Lake every day, driving south from Woods Cross all the way towards Nephi, towards Santaquin, to Provo, where I was doing all the deliveries, I was kind of feeling this directionless feeling, and I wasn't sure what to do with my life. And I was really not liking my job. I didn't like my boss. I didn't like the work. I didn't like dealing with customers. I didn't like this and that. And I'm sure a lot of us can sympathize with hating your job, right? But every day I was driving past in 33rd South in Salt Lake, there was a Coca-Cola billboard. A lot of puzzled faces. Yeah, a Coca-Cola billboard. And it said the simple line, "Enjoy everything." I kept driving past this billboard every single day, hating my job, hating what's going on, not liking my life, feeling ostracized by all of my friends and a lot of my family, and not liking what's going on in my life, but every day passing it, enjoy everything, enjoy everything, enjoy everything. And eventually I just came to this idea, this agreement with myself. Okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to see if I can enjoy everything. I'm going to try my hardest every single day to enjoy what I'm doing. It seems really simple, but it's actually a lot more challenging than you can think. And sometimes that idea of trying to find the enjoyment in something, even if it's something you don't want to do, can actually be a fun endeavor in and of itself and generate that enjoyment. Even if I'm doing a chore that I don't want to do, even if I'm, doing errands that I don't want to do, I can take enjoyment in it because I am working and I'm exercising my mind to find the enjoyment in what it is that I'm doing. And I see that as kind of a turning point in my life. That's like a lot of people in faith traditions will be like, I had this, second birth moment. I had this like coming to Jesus moment. That was my coming to happiness moment, was a Coca-Cola billboard. So hiding in plain sight. Regardless, I was still kind of not knowing what to do with my life. I was still struggling with, what I wanted to do, and driving trucks kind of sucked. So eventually I moved out to Colorado. When I got to Colorado, I made friends with people that were not Mormon or had never been Mormon. It was really weird because you grow up in Utah and you're like, everybody in the world is Mormon, right? And then you move outside of Utah and you're like, oh, Mormonism is actually really tiny. The world is huge. Mormonism is this little tiny group. And I begin becoming friends with people I would call polymaths, people who just love knowledge, love information, who can't get enough information. And one of these guys was a coworker of mine, Markin. And he was this guy who grew up Hindu. And he was not a believer in it or anything, but he was so incredibly smart and very outspoken and very overbearing. But any time that you would want to talk about something, he would have some informed opinion about that. And that, through conversations with this guy, that's when I began to fall in love with information. When I began to understand that my brain clinging on to new information and truly grasping it and understanding that is a good feeling. That gives me an endorphin kick. Like, I love new information. That drew me towards a direction that I felt like I could pursue. Love of information. So once you can enjoy everything and you see how much information is out in the world and you love information, the world can't help but be an awesome place for somebody in my headspace. So eventually, I made friends with another guy who was Christian, who had studied up on Mormon history, which, if you move outside of Utah, there are some of those out there. People who were taught by their pastors how Mormonism is a cult and it's satanic and it's evil. And here's No Man Knows My History, and, read that and you'll know everything you need to shred those Mormon missionaries to pieces and show them that they're following a false prophet. Whatever, that didn't matter. But I would get into conversations with this guy because I was also listening to a lot of atheist podcasts and watching a lot of debates between theists and atheists. And I was kind of coming to grips with the arguments for and against the existence of a God. And this guy was a Christian anti-Mormon, as we call them, right? But I was just a person who was apathetic towards the question of God, or, a marginally atheist. And he started presenting me with information about Mormonism that I didn't know about. And it was a whole world that I didn't even know exists, right? So he said the horrible accusation that Mormonism isn't Christianity. Can anybody sympathize with having to debunk that argument? Jesus Christ is in the name of the church. Of course it's Christian, right? So I made that rebuttal to his horrible argument. And he said, here, read these books. He handed me books that he had on his shelf. Read these books, and then we'll talk. And I said, okay, that sounds good. No Man Knows My History was one of them. And I read it, and I realized that I don't know anything about the religion that I grew up in. I was taught it my entire life. I was indoctrinated into it. I was taught to believe unequivocally that it is true, but I honestly know nothing about it. And that started me tumbling down the rabbit hole. And eventually, I was listening to a lot of podcasts and also reading. I was watching a lot of documentaries. And this will go into something we're going to talk about soon here. But also in Colorado, cannabis had just been legalized. So my typical day was go to work, come home from work, working 10, 11 hours a day, and sit down in front of my TV or sit down with a book, light up, and just read or watch and just think. Now, for anyone who doesn't have any experience with cannabis, it has certain mentally opening properties. Honestly, it can sometimes open your mind so much that your brains fall out, so that's not great. But it does cause you to think about things in ways that you otherwise might not be able to think about them. And that really accelerated my love of information, and it accelerated my comprehension of information as well. And like I said, that's just a little teaser for what I'm going to talk about here near the end of the presentation. But essentially, I started looking for a podcast that was about Mormon history. A serialized Mormon history podcast. It has to be out there, right? There are hundreds of thousands of podcasts out there. It's my primary mode of ingesting information because I'm driving so many hours a day. But it wasn't there. I looked everywhere. I looked for weeks and I couldn't find it. So finally I said, you know what? I'm going to make the podcast that I want. I'm going to make the perfect podcast that I am looking for. And I did. I made it. And there's an entire backstory behind that. I think I'll forego that. But essentially, I got started podcasting, and I made the serialized history of Mormonism. When I started studying Mormon history, I learned about popular Mormon history. We have the first vision accounts. We have, little dabblings into polygamy. We have the Book of Abraham. We have the things that, that basically the CES letter book is comprised of is popular Mormon history. That is the next echelon above what most Mormons know about their religion, right? We're a member in the church. There's a barrier of entry of information that we don't know about. Once we begin understanding that, oh, wait, there's more than one account of the first vision experience. You mean the one that's in the Pearl of Great Price? That's part of our scriptures? That has inconsistencies? Why? That great question. Why? That is a powerful question. So once you start asking those questions, you enter into a degree of knowledge that you didn't know existed until you started down that rabbit hole. And that's where the popular Mormon history lives. That's where the fun gotchas about Mormon history live. That's where, Joseph Smith married a 14-year-old girl, Helen Mar Kimball. That's where that history lives, is in the popular Mormon history. And that's what I learned about. And that's what I started writing and putting into scripts and reading into the podcast. As I progressed into this field, into this world of Mormon history, I began attending Sunstone and John Whitmer Historical Association and other conferences, and actually talking to Mormon historians and realizing that the world of Mormon history is actually much more complex and much more fascinating than just the popular Mormon history is. And there's the second degree of this information that is all of the popular history. Actual Mormon history that's happening at the academic level is that third degree. That's the celestial Mormon history. And that is the community that I have found so interesting, so fascinating, that really couples my love of enjoying everything and my love of information into an endless pursuit of attaining the knowledge of Mormon history. And now I spend most of my time every day reading and writing about Mormon history. I'm able to, through listener funding, make it my full-time job, that I work from home and I produce, 3 podcasts a week about Mormon history. because I could be doing this podcast for 30 years and never scrape the edges of the barrel, never get to the bottom of it, because it's so incredibly complex. And then somehow ex-Mormon meetup groups invite me, and I don't know why, but here I am, and I am so excited to share that information with people who are willing to hear about it. So along this path, I've picked up a lot of tidbits about Mormon history that I'd like to share with you. And these are not the popular Mormon history. These are not the Book of Abraham is actually ancient Egyptian papyri purchased from Michael Chandler in 1835 in Kirtland and published in 1840. This is not the popular Mormon history. This is just what I have come to appreciate about Mormon history after studying it for 5 years. Now, if I were to make this list in another 5 years, it'd be completely different. If I were to make it in 20 years from now, it would be completely different. But if all of you are willing to hear it, this is kind of my list. Does that sound good? Yeah? Okay. The first thing that strikes me is the disparity between the Joseph Smith we're taught about and the Joseph Smith of history. Now, this may seem pretty simple, right? And the First Vision accounts are the differences in it provide an amazing analogy of there's the canonized scriptural prophet Joseph Smith, and then there's the Joseph Smith that's a little bit more interesting and nuanced that actually left 3 other accounts of the First Vision long before that 1838 edition, right? That is just a tiny example of this disparity, because we're taught about this one-dimensional figure. We're painted a portrait of Joseph Smith, and when we begin to learn about who he really was, that portrait seems to lack true color. It lacks character. There's no artistic development to it. It's just lame. So, understanding the divide between the real Joseph Smith and the pious Joseph Smith really is quite an interesting idea, because he was not just a religious leader. That was just one feather in his cap. He also built and established multiple armies, built and established multiple cities. He hoodwinked and swindled people out of hundreds of thousands of dollars by creating shadow companies and creating stock options in those companies and commanding people through divine dictates from God to buy stock into those companies. He was such an incredibly fascinating person. He had his enemies. He had his devoted, loyal friends. Many of his friends became his most avowed enemies throughout his life. He is just a really complex kind of guy. And he's also one of the most well-documented religious leaders that we have in Christianity, in Protestant Christianity from the 19th century America. There are many others, but because Joseph Smith has had such a weird following his entire life and after his life, he's one of the best documented religious leaders that we have from the American 19th century. And what that makes a possibility for is investigating him in a comparative religious capacity. Because if we can understand Joseph Smith, suddenly we can understand Jesus Christ. We can understand Muhammad. We can understand a myriad of other Christian religious leaders or Judeo-Christian religious leaders who followed the same patterns and created the same trajectories as Joseph Smith. And that's when we really begin to have a nuanced understanding of who this guy really was, instead of just thinking about him as being a guy who sits in a chapel and reads his Bible, reads his Book of Mormon, and always has a pithy line to say when somebody has some kind of moral conundrum. So that's my most fascinating first point of why I'm fascinated by Mormon history. The second one is the role of the Book of Mormon in early Mormonism. It may shock some of you to know this, but the Book of Mormon is rarely discussed in early Mormonism. Much like today, I guess not much like today, but today, people, you read the Book of Mormon, missionaries hand you a Book of Mormon, you read it, you get baptized, and then you study it. You read about it in seminary and in your elders' quorum or relief society. You talk about it in church. But in the Kirtland era of Mormonism, particularly, the very first large gathering headquarters of Mormonism, the Book of Mormon is almost completely absent from any teachings that are given, from any of the sermons that are given. Almost everything is about the Bible. So Mormonism today holds this Book of Mormon up as this, this amazing scripture, But if we look back to the original church, very little of it is actually focused on the Book of Mormon. It was just a Protestant Christian sect, and they debated and bickered over the Bible. Very little sermons actually even reference the existence of the Book of Mormon, let alone talking about the moral conundrums like Nephi killing Laban and, General Moroni and these various stories that we all kind of know by heart today. Those are just completely absent from the record in early Mormonism, which I find that very interesting. This is a church built on the Book of Mormon, and the Book of Mormon is the keystone of this religion. Why wasn't it more prominent in the early years? Something I can't understand. I can't reconcile. But it's also something that most people just don't pay attention to. Third point is, after entering the world of Mormon history, after coming to befriend some Mormon historians and talking to them, attending Sunstone and John Whitmer and these other conferences, you come to find out where people stand. You come to find out where people's arguments typically are and where bickering happens. And I've come to also learn that a lot of the bickering that happens in the field of Mormon historians actually centers around the issue of polygamy, which is kind of surprising because I figured when I was a member of the church, there's the church historians, the approved of Leonard Arrington style church historians, and then there's the anti-Mormon historians. There's the Gerald and Sandra Tanners out there, and they're anti-Mormon. We don't pay attention to them. But as you come to learn after studying enough of the history, that basically historians agree on a central narrative that is very well documented. And that the points of Mormon versus anti-Mormon argumentation largely comes down to, is this source actually trustworthy? Usually that's the source of argumentation, and a lot of that argumentation comes down to the practice of polygamy, because that seems so counter to our ideas of what is okay in society. I just find that fascinating. As a kid growing up in the church, or as a member in the church, you know nothing about the history, or maybe just a little bit here and there. You're taught to fear the idea of anti-Mormon literature, but Mormon history academia is actually, the term anti-Mormon doesn't really hold any sway in actual Mormon history academia, because it's like, what's the source? Is this source antagonistic? Is it trustworthy? What's the context of the source? What's the dating of it? How long after the fact is it? It's the actual study of history is a lot more nuanced than just saying this is from a church-approved source or this is anti-Mormon literature, therefore should be ignored. So that's just a small disparity that I've had to kind of come to grips with as well. Another point that I find interesting in church history is persecution. Persecution is something we all know about. I mean, shout it out. Persecution. What's something that we hear about in the church history about persecution? Hans Mill. Anything else? Extermination order. Yeah. Hans Mill extermination order. They occurred within a few days of each other. Joseph Smith's death. Is that what you said? Yeah. The martyrdom at Carthage. Gays. Yeah. David Hiram Smith being incarcerated in a mental asylum for his entire life because he was gay. No, the idea of persecution is kind of a tough one. It's a surprisingly complex word when we talk about it, because what the Mormons experienced in some respect was persecution, and some of that had to do with the religious aspect of the church, but a lot more of it had to do with the fact that Joseph Smith was just a dick. Okay? He swindled a lot of people out of a lot of money. He stole men's wives. He lied to people. He was a habitual liar, and people didn't like him. He also tried to convert people's freed slaves in a slave state. You're threatening people's livelihoods when you do that. That's a really big mistake, especially blue-blooded Missouri Democrats who operate by lynch mob law. You don't do that. Joseph Smith was many things, but occasionally he was dumb. So when we talk about persecution, it's always like, oh, they're the Mormons. They're an outsider religion. They're a religion that the Methodists and the Campbellite Baptists and that the other religions just didn't like because they had a new scripture. That played into the persecution, and I say that in air quotes, But there's so much more to it. And when we look at the economic perspective of a lot of this, like the Mormons squatting on land and improving it and hoping that the government grants them deeds for it, like the Mormons starting the Kirtland Safety Society and bilking hundreds of people out of tens of thousands of dollars. When we look at the secular side of that, religious persecution seems to come into focus of people not liking this one guy because he screwed them over. So the term persecution really takes on a nuanced understanding when you begin studying Mormon history in depth. And in some respects, the term persecution tends to lose definition. Because if everything that happened to the Mormons is persecution, then everything that happened to any group of outsiders was all persecution, and it can't be explained by anything else. But if we seek to understand the reasons behind what they call persecution happening, then everything comes into a lot more focus, and we can talk about the Mormon depredations, and we can talk about the Danites, we can talk about Joseph Smith creating a shadow military and surrounding the homes of public officials and forcing them to sign documents under duress. We can talk about Mormons playing with elections and people getting mad about that. We can talk about a lot of the more secular aspects that really cause that persecution narrative. So, see a question? Yeah, so the comment, just for getting it on the record, nobody's mentioned that he was an occultist and a Freemason, and a lot of his finances were, financed through Freemasons, other fellow Freemasons. That had a lot to do with it as well, right? He embodied a lifestyle and a worldview that was extremely common in the day, that everything in the world is moved and shaped by magical forces that we can control through spells and through seer stones and through divining rods. We can divine the words and the spirit of God by understanding the world around us, by saying these spells, by creating prayer circles, by creating these magic sigils. And that ran counter to what a lot of people considered was acceptable, but is something that Joseph Smith believed in and something that a lot of people believed in, right? Joseph Smith was not, an anomaly in his beliefs in occultism. And same with Masonry, right? He ran counter to a lot of Masons, especially when he established the Nauvoo Lodge in Nauvoo. He started basically converting all Mormons, or ascending all of the Mormon men to Master Masons within a very short period of time, which then the number of Mormon Masons began to number about half of the Masons in the rest of the country. And Masons were not happy about that. So that had quite a bit to do with the persecution as well, is very influential and powerful politicians who are Masons are like, what is this guy doing? We can't just let this happen. So, another comment? So can we stop there and not talk about the level of Masonry in the church today? I don't really have much to say about that. The hierarchy of it today, how much Masonry is in it. Well, the thing is Masonry doesn't purport to be a secretive sect. They say we're in plain sight. We're here if you are interested in us. You can join. You can come to our lodges. You can do, as long as you're a man, right? Of course. At least they share that aspect together. But like Masonry is interesting, but the way that I view Masonry, especially when it comes to early Mormon leaders being Masons, I see Masonry as basically the school, whereas occultism and numerology and phrenology and some divination and some of these practices are kind of like the curricula that were shared in Masonic lodges. So just because somebody is a Mason doesn't mean that they are therefore inherently, an occultist or something like that. It just so happens that in Joseph Smith's day, a lot of people who practiced occultism and who were interested in alchemy and in these other esoteric arts, a lot of them did happen to be Masons, and a lot of their fellow Masons, that's where they exchanged information. That's where they shared books. That's where they talked about these intellectual pursuits, was in Masonic Lodge. And a lot of the early church leaders were members of Masonry. And, I don't know, as far as members today being members of Masonry, I think, or the hierarchy today, I feel like they probably understand that there are Masonic connections and that they probably hold to the Heber C. Kimball version of like, we have the celestial Masonry. And that's okay. That's just fine. So. Yeah. let's wait for Q&A for anything like that. And unfortunately, that is a rabbit hole. I call that a rabbit black hole because there's no reemerging out the other side. So, continuing on some of the more interesting points that I've found. Translation, much like persecution, translation tends to be an extremely interesting word because, well, okay, so what does translation mean? You take one language, you turn it into another language, right? That's the secular academic understanding of what translation means. Not in Mormonism. We get special pleading. We get to say, no, we have our definition of translation. The rest of the world can use their definition because we have Joseph Smith translating the Bible from English into different English. We have Joseph Smith translating Reformed Egyptian, I'm using air quotes for all of these because they're not real things, from gold plates written by Native Americans into Jacobean English. We have Joseph Smith translating ancient Egyptian papyri written by Father Abraham himself into English as well. Translation has a very interesting definition, an interesting word, and I also find it even more fascinating because we don't use in the church the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. Granted, it wasn't a project that he finished before his death, but it's like we hold to all of these things that Joseph Smith translated. We talk about the Book of Moses that's in our Pearl of Great Price. We have Joseph Smith translation Matthew that's in our Pearl of Great Price. It's just, one sermon of Jesus that's his translation of it. We hold to these certain books that he translated, including the Book of Abraham, Book of Mormon. But his translation of the Bible, that should be the ultimate. It's a Christian sect. He translated the Bible through the gift and power of God. Why don't we hold to that? Oh, well, it's in our footnotes. It's in the references section that are references the Joseph Smith translation. Why the King James Version? Why do we use that book? Why not the Joseph Smith translation? I've never found a definitive answer to that before, but I think it does speak to the weird definitions that we use for the word translation in the church because it's a religion. Words don't really matter, do they? So, another point that I find fascinating is the actual role of Scripture in the church. So when it comes to like Bible scholars, they're using the Bible to understand history because it's not a book, it's not a history book. The Bible was written before the field of history started, before the idea of writing biographies and autobiographies really was a thing. But the Bible can be used in order to understand some of the social and political dynamics that were going on in the specific books that are written from the specific times. Also, certain wars that are going on, certain geographies, certain little details can be garnered from the Bible. But the Book of Mormon doesn't really lend itself to that very much because there's a threshold, right? When we start reading the Book of Mormon, when we're just reading the Book of Mormon to get the spiritual enlightenment from it, we're just studying it standalone. We are just reading it for the passages. We are using it to understand the very simplistic, one-dimensional characters, this hero General Moroni, this horrible apostate Korihor. We're understanding these very simplistic narratives, simplistic ideas, simplistic people, and trying to understand the supposed profundity behind them. But it rarely rises beyond the threshold of using the Book of Mormon as a historical text, because the Bible is an ancient book. The Book of Mormon is not an ancient book. Once you cross that threshold of saying, I'm reading the Book of Mormon to understand the spiritual enlightenment from it, into the threshold of, I'm reading the Book of Mormon to understand the history of the Native Americans, you're at a crossroads. You have to decide whether or not you're going to jump down the apologetics hole and try and, go to the Wayne May perspective and the Dan Peterson and all of the Mormon apologists, if you're going to go that direction, or if you're going to say, oh, this is not a history book, and then you have a number of choices after that. But very rarely is the Book of Mormon in church used as an actual study text for understanding history, because I think that the church leadership knows that it's not a historical book. And the longer that they continue to carve out the exception, the intellectual area where it can still be claimed as a historical book, the longer they're being dishonest. And I think the more ex-Mormons they're creating. So good. Keep it up, guys. And also the stories of the people, like when we're talking about, the moral questions that are posed in the Bible of like Abraham offering his son Isaac as a sacrifice at the command of God, and God, rescuing Isaac by presenting a ram. There's some interesting moral questions when we study that story. The story of Job, right? And God and Satan making a deal. Like, I bet I can turn this guy away from you, but Job just being faithful through all of these horrible things that God cursed him with, killing his family, giving him sores, destroying his property. There are some really interesting questions that are posed in the Bible by the stories if we take a non-historical or just, if we look at it as mythology. But the Book of Mormon characters are so one-sided. They're so simplistic, right? So if we're talking about Abraham and Isaac, it's interesting. If we're talking about Nephi and Laban, Nephi stumbled on a guy who was drunk and killed him because he wanted to steal a book. There's really not a deep moral conundrum that's placed here other than you better follow the commandment of God. Right? With Abraham and Isaac, at least we're posed with this idea of like, would I sacrifice my own child because God commanded me to? Nephi and Laban, it's like, Nephi wanted to steal this guy's book, so he killed him. So there's just a very simplistic level the Book of Mormon characters exist at that is not very enriching to somebody who's trying to examine it through a critical lens of like, what is the mythology behind this? What am I actually supposed to garner from this? What moral conundrums am I supposed to suffer through in understanding what's going on here? Because so often the stories come down to, well, be charitable, be nice, follow the commandments of God. But at least the Bible, when we read it through, there's a lot more complexity and a lot more nuance. And the people are fallible. They're not one-sided, heroes and villains. They're flawed. They're flawed human beings. Similar with definitions, like I talked about earlier with persecution and with translation, prophecy and revelation are really fascinating words to me. So when we think about a Joseph Smith prophecy, I mean, what does that sound like to anybody here? I mean, when you think Joseph Smith being a prophet, it's like he translated the Book of Mormon. Right? He could only do that if he was a prophet. He gave revelations that became the Doctrine and Covenants. He could only do that if he was a prophet. He created a religion. He had God and Jesus appear to him and tell him that all the religions are evil and their professors corrupt. He could only do that because he was a prophet. And when we read through Joseph Smith's revelations, they all come with this terminology of thus saith the Lord your God. Go buy me a printing press. Thus saith the Lord, you go to the eastern states and do a mission. Right? That's what so much of the Doctrine and Covenants is. But revelation and prophecy today, the disparity between how we understand a prophecy and revelation in Joseph Smith's day, as opposed to what it looks like today, is very different. Because now, anything that's churned out of Mormon newsroom.org. I say that because I'll take the name change seriously when they take it seriously. But anything that comes out in Mormon newsroom that's called prophecy. That's called revelation. The November 2015 policy when it came out, revelation. The rescission of it 3.5 years later, revelation. When you're using the terms prophecy and revelation and applying it to everything that comes out of the church, it loses definition. The word means nothing anymore. So here's a test, right? Here's a litmus test. What prophecy could Nelson give that would show him to be a false prophet? And if the person can't come up with an example of what that would be, then the term is completely meaningless. So, understanding the disparity of Joseph Smith's prophecies and knowing that there are no more thus saith the Lord type prophecies coming out of the Brighamite tradition, I think that's a very fascinating detail, and it shows how much the church has changed towards a more corporatist kind of nature. I guess that kind of reveals this larger trend that the church has changed a lot since the earliest years, right? So this is something that I believed when I was a kid, right? I grew up in the church. Joseph Smith restored the ancient church. He restored the original church that was placed here by Adam and Eve, or that was, given to Adam by God in the Garden of Eden. Joseph Smith restored that church after Jesus died and all the apostles died and it was lost and the Dark Ages happened. Joseph Smith restored that one true church. I didn't understand that there was an entire continuum of his 14-year ministry where he implemented different things. He tried different things and then retracted them. He, floated out some trial balloons of what he could get away with and then later walked back on it, especially when it came to polygamy. His church was a very fluid church. It was constantly changing, constantly adapting. But the church that I learned about when I was growing up it was restored in 1830. That's the church we practice today. But it's just not that simple. The church is always changing. The church is always adapting. And if the last 3.5 years with the November exclusion policy are any sort of testament to what that looks like, it can happen on a whim. And it's probably dictated by market forces. Weird. So the church does operate as a business today. Joseph Smith tried to operate the church as a business. He was a terrible businessman. He was charismatic. He was awesome. People loved to hear him talk. One power that Joseph Smith had that was truly remarkable was on a one-on-one individual level. He could connect with somebody and they could feel like he was speaking to their heart. He had an incredible ability, an animalistic, magnetic nature to his personality that allowed people to instantly connect with him and feel like they were best friends. And obviously that comes very much in handy when you're trying to steal money and wives from those people. But Brigham Young was a business guy. He didn't have the charisma. Brigham Young was a businessman. He was a ledger book watcher. He was a bean counter. He dotted every T. He crossed every I. I know I said that backwards. He did everything to make the church a corporate empire, and he died one of the wealthiest men in America. He was successful. And the church today looks much more like Brigham's Utah theocracy, and we're living in St. George. Ooh, anyone know what St. George? Know the person St. George is named after? George A. Smith. Not George Albert Smith, George A. Smith. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this theocracy is born out of Brigham Young's church. Joseph Smith never dreamt of having this church that Brigham Young built. But had he had an ultimate vision of a church in his mind, today would be it. This would be the church that Joseph Smith wanted. As far as membership numbers and liquid assets goes, I guess. Another thing that's really striking, and I think this will be my final point before I introduce you to my newest research on the entheogen theory and psychedelics. To understand the church, to understand what it means to be a Mormon, a non-member or an outsider would have to study their entire lives if they didn't have the opportunity to go to church, right? So to understand the church today, I mean, you can read the Book of Mormon, but it doesn't tell you much about the church, right? It tells you to be charitable, and it tells you that polygamy is evil. But in order to understand the church as it operates today, you need to read the Journal of Discourses, the Doctrine and Covenants, the Pearl of Great Price, probably the Book of the Law of the Lord. What else? The King Follett Discourse, you definitely need to read that. The High Council Minutes, that'd be really helpful. The Council of 50 Minutes, they were just released. If you read those, you'll understand the church today. And still, even then, after reading all of those, you wouldn't understand everything that is built into Utah culture. You still wouldn't understand why the certain ceremonies are practiced the way that they're practiced in the temple today. You wouldn't understand where they came from because there's nothing in church scripture and doctrine that dictates what is in the temple the temple ceremony, right? So there's a lot of institutionalized and cultural knowledge that we are all grown up with and that we are all indoctrinated into, whether we're born into it or we convert to it, that you could never understand through a life of study at an intellectual level. And that's just something that's so fascinating to me, because if you want to know about Christianity, you read the New Testament. If you want to know about most other versions of Christianity, you read about, you read about headlines about those Christian sects, or you read about the people who started it. You read their Bible commentaries and you know why the church practices what it does today. Why it's opposed to infant baptism or whatever, or why so on and so forth. But to understand the entirety of Mormonism and the reason why all of us are the way we are, you have to spend years in this church. You can't get that from just the books that are produced by the church, which is very hard for me to understand. There are a few other points, maybe we get into them in question and answer, but option number 3, I teased it at the beginning. One of my fields of study and personal research, so I spend my time researching church history from historians who have compiled their historiographies and biographies, right? I'm reading the polished version of history that historians have constructed. I do very little actual on the ground first source research that I am doing, but what I am studying is the possibility and to what extent psychedelics actually influenced early Mormonism. And I more chuckles from the crowd. Okay, every time it's such an interesting question of what people think about when, maybe what would happen to a person's faith if they knew that Joseph Smith was putting mushrooms in the sacrament. It's a weird question, isn't it? I don't know. I mean, maybe we can get into this in Q&A a little bit, maybe more of a conversation afterwards, but what would that have done to your faith? Maybe just think on that. You would have Make Mormonism great again. You want some more sacrament? Yeah. Let's find out what's really in that anointing oil. Right. So what's interesting is in early Mormonism, in the Kirtland era of Mormonism specifically, and the very brief time in New York prior to Kirtland era, there's a lot of visionary experiences. There's a lot of people seeing angels floating around. People who thought that the Kirtland Temple was on fire. People who saw God walking through the congregation. People seeing things that were like, what is going on here? So how this ended up beginning, how I began studying this was I was studying up on the Kirtland Temple dedication ceremony. And I was reading these visionary accounts of people talking about angels flying through the rafters, people hearing a loud whooshing noise, like wind was rushing through the church or through the temple. And also reading about the barrels of wine that the congregation consumed during the dedication ceremony, and the fact that they had been fasting for 24 hours beforehand. I heard, oh my God, in the back. So if anyone has any experience with psychedelics, if you want to get the most potent effect, you fast beforehand. That makes for a lower dosage before you cross into the state of mind and into the altered state of consciousness where you can actually have visions and hallucinations and reality seems to crumble around you. So how I began studying, or how I kind of came onto this, it was something that I stumbled on. And much in the case of most things in academic circles, it's something you just stumble on. You're like, well, this is really weird. And then you form a hypothesis around it. And then you study information that hopefully proves or dismisses your hypothesis. Then you alter your hypothesis and you formulate a new theory. And hopefully with enough adaptation, that theory can be proven tenable. That's how the scientific method works. Now, history is not a direct science, but it works in much the same ways. You construct theories based on evidence that's available to you, and then you test that theory based on further evidence and further testing. And then you adjust your hypothesis accordingly. So when I was studying the Kirtland Temple dedication, I said a couple of times when I was doing it on the podcast, I said a couple of times that it sounds like the Mormons are on drugs here. It sounds like this consecrated oil, this consecrated wine, has something infused in it, which it seems completely reasonable when you understand all of the visionary accounts. There are dozens of them. I got an email. After I aired that episode, I got an email from a guy named Cody. And Cody Nakoni said, you have no idea what you've stumbled on. And he sent me a couple of resources and said, here, read these and let's get together. I got to talk to you. And I said, okay. So Cody lived a few hours from me. He came up and we talked. He told me what he knows about psychedelics and the history of psychedelics, because that's his field of study, is the history of psychedelics. It's actually a wonderfully fascinating field of academic history. And a lot of it has to do with studying the history of medicine, which is a really interesting field in and of itself. So he started talking to me about to what extent the psychedelics could have been influenced in there. And we began a 9-month-long research project of writing a paper that we presented at Sunstone 2017. We called it Revelation Through Hallucination, a treatise on the Joseph Smith entheogen theory. And in it, we basically compile the idea that Joseph Smith was using psychedelics in early Mormonism to incite spiritual experiences for the Mormons. So after this, I went to... let me find this. Okay. So I went to Sunstone 2018, and I spoke with a guy named Lachlan Mackay. Does anybody know Lachlan by any chance? Goes by Locke? One hand at the very back, somebody who I know has been to Sunstone before. Lachlan Mackay is one of the Quorum of Apostles of the Community of Christ. And he's also an amazing historian. I haven't read any of his books, but I've read a number of his articles, and he's very methodical and very calculated. So he and I were talking at this barbecue after Sunstone, and we were just chatting about what he's working on, what I'm working on. And we got to talking about psychedelics and early Mormonism, and he said, well, have you heard about... And if you want to listen to this newest research that I have recently unearthed, you're going to have to go and listen to this episode on patreon.com/nakedmormonism. And if you want to hear this part specifically, you're going to have to jump to about the 53.5-minute mark. That's where this portion begins. So once again, patreon.com/nakedmormonism to financially support this show and continue to allow me to do the research that is required in order to compile this information and disseminate it out to the masses. And to all of you who do support the show, thank you so much. So, one thing that's interesting about studying the field of psychedelics is there are a lot of people who use psychedelics frequently who wholeheartedly believe in God. So when we talk about possibly Joseph Smith using psychedelics in the anointing oil, in the sacrament, in early Mormonism, and using that as a naturalistic explanation for the visionary accounts that we see in early Mormonism, it holds naturalistic explanatory power, but it also doesn't therefore mean that all Mormonism is false. That is my way of trying to package this idea in a way that won't cause all Mormons to say, you're an anti-Mormon. Because I find it extremely compelling. I find it very fascinating. And if psychedelics were used in early Mormonism, I want to know about that. Because, hey, Mormonism used to be really cool. So that's my newest field of study into psychedelics use. There's a lot more to it. I also have a paper with 3 other co-authors that is hopefully going to be coming out in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies. That is an expansion of the original Sunstone paper that will be printed in an actual peer-reviewed journal instead of just self-published. So that's what I currently study at the first level, at the initial level of academic research. And those are some of the things that I find interesting in Mormonism and a little bit about me. So thank you all.
I have 2 questions, both of them pretty short. Bryce mentioned that the Book of Mormon was not used in the early church. I've heard that the first vision was completely unknown to the other early church members as well, probably because Joseph hadn't thought it up yet. Could you tell us about that? And also, you mentioned that one of the boxes you checked was an Eagle Scout. After about 100 years partnership with the Boy Scouts of America, the church recently pulled out. Do you have any background information on that?
That's a couple interesting questions. Yeah, so the Book of Mormon and the first vision being basically absent from the church. Nobody knew about the first vision experience or the account until the early to mid 1830s, which is about 12 years after it supposedly happened. That definitely cast the whole thing into question. And of course, the person who wrote about it, it was autobiographical. And I'd like to think that Joseph Smith had an agenda when he wrote the first vision experience, right? He manufactured it in the 1830s. He honed it and made it much more distinct and distilled in 1838. It was eventually published in 1842 in multiple different places. It's a fabrication. I think Joseph Smith was stumbling around the woods, picking up mushrooms, and he had a wicked trip. Thought he saw the heavens open up, then he thought he saw angels, then he thought he saw God, but it was really heavy, man. And then he later theophanized that. He later turned that into this incredible, miraculous account. But once again, that's one of the aspects where I think psychedelics hold explanatory power. Because a dude stumbling around high in the woods, or tripping out in the woods, he could sincerely believe that God's appearing to him, but he could also not remember the details of it. The details might be a little fuzzy, and may use that as a way to catalyze the creation of his religion. Similar, so with the Eagle Scout and Scouts divorcing from, or the church divorcing itself from the Scouts, the church's relationship with Boy Scouts of America has been really tenuous since they started allowing gay guys to be scoutmasters. The church has really been trying to compose a way to get out of their agreement since then. And, them finally turning it into Scouts of America and letting women into Scouts. That was it. Final straw. It's over. So, the Scouts of America isn't really going to hurt that much from this. There's going to be a little bit of growing pains to make it kind of mesh. There's going to be a lot of people who were members who were Scouts and members of the church who no longer are going to Scouts because they're no longer affiliated, who are then going to join up Scouts again. I know that the church has tried some trial programs as replacement programs for Scouts of America. One of them that I read, it was a blog post of somebody who went to like this Book of Mormon camp where they were reenacting the armies of Helaman. And it's haphazard. It's hasty. It's not going to turn out well. And a lot of people who try those programs out, if they ever do roll them out in larger numbers, they're going to say this sucks and they're going to go to scouting. So it was the church cutting off its nose to spite its face. Yeah. Where's the mic? If you want to say it loud, I'll try and repeat it back in the mic if you'd like.
You've mentioned mushrooms quite a few times. Is there evidence for psilocybin, or whatever it's called, stuff in mushrooms anywhere? Psilocybin, yeah, that's it. In church history or any of the documents or anything that you've seen?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So we're trying to walk this line when it comes to psychedelics and early Mormonism. If somebody is using these things as a way to connect with the deity above, they're probably not going to be terribly transparent about it, because if that secret gets out, then anybody can connect to God and they don't need the Mormon sacrament, right? So I haven't found the documentation that is Joseph Smith's order form to Frederick G. Williams that says, I need 13 bags of psilocybin mushrooms. We haven't found that, unfortunately. It's not through lack of trying, I promise. We'd really like to find that. The best evidence that we found so far that is explicit psychedelics is patreon.com/NakedMormonism. It's really a powerful point of evidence. But there are a few other candidates, right? So there's mescaline, and mescaline is present in peyote buttons as well as Amanita muscaria mushrooms. Amanita muscarias are the red cap, white spotted mushrooms that you see, the toadstool mushrooms that you see depicted in art everywhere. Those are powerfully psychedelic mushrooms. Psilocybin are definitely common in the area. They grow around there everywhere. A lot of them grow after the first rain of fall, right in September. In the woods, they like to grow on felled trees, on bark that's on the ground, used as a substrate. So they were everywhere. But actually finding the one document that is like Joseph Smith requesting, X number of mushrooms from somebody. No, we haven't been that lucky, but we also have reason to believe that they probably would have concealed that information and never have recorded it in the first place. So that makes the entire study a little bit trickier.
I have two questions. One is your reaction to rough stone rolling, which seems to try to explain Joseph Smith as a human being.
Yeah.
And then the other question is what your research has told you about Boyd K. Packer and what he's done to the church.
Yeah. Rough stone rolling came out when the church needed it to. So prior to rough stone rolling coming out, Richard Bushman and Leonard Arrington were working on this idea of new Mormon history. They were trying to create a version of Mormon history that is similar to like the Community of Christ holds to today, that like, yeah, Joseph Smith was into the occult stuff. He was, a con man. He was using the seer stones. He was into this. And they hold to the Book of Mormon as not a historical text, but, inspired the way that all writings are inspired by God, because we're all human beings. We're all inspired by God to do whatever we do. And every book is therefore inspired by God. right? So the community of Christ, that's kind of more the perspective that they hold. And I hope I'm not falsely characterizing that. But when it comes to the rough stone rolling, that was the church's way of saying, we have some historical problems we really got to deal with, but we don't want it to come from an unofficial church publication. So Richard Bushman and Leonard Arrington, among other historians, were trying to create this idea of New Mormon history. And Boyd K. Packer was one of the people who was a figurehead of squashing that. They wanted to create a more nuanced perspective of Mormon history. And Boyd K. Packer, Nelson Hinckley, a few of the others who were, leaders at the time in the apostles, they were not ready to make that step. And therefore they squashed the idea. So fast forward to the early 2000s, Richard Bushman, he finally gets this book out when the church needed it the most, when the 2002 Olympics were coming and a lot of focus was cast towards Utah, when Romney was becoming a more prominent politician, when he was thinking about running for president. 2002 was a really interesting idea because the entire world turned towards Utah, and you can't look at Utah without looking at Mormonism. So Rough Stone Rolling came out around that time, and it did wonders for creating a field where people can have a nuanced perspective of church history and still believe in it. But it was also shattering to a lot of people's testimonies because they learned of Joseph Smith that didn't exist in their mind before reading that book. But of course the church had plausible deniability because it wasn't a church published book, and Richard Bushman didn't do it under the auspices of working for the church when he published it. So it's an important book. All the other things Boyd K. Packer did to the church. He was a horrible human being. And I also think, given enough evidence of his harshly homophobic rhetoric, I also tend to believe in the camp or with the people who think that he was closeted gay and was heavily repressing those ideas. And he probably was dealing with a lot of personal trauma from repressing his own sexuality for so many years. And he projected that trauma. He projected his own frustrations, his own insecurities on his leadership role. And he impacted the church in ways that I can't summarize them in 10 minutes. Him and Spencer W. Kimball did more to damage generations of Mormons than any two other individuals in the church ever did, except maybe Joseph Smith. Sorry, behind you. Well, so I'll just speak to, I'm not going to try and summarize it into the mic because I don't remember everything that you said, but I'll just speak very briefly to Masonry and Mormonism. Yes, they are very similar institutions. A lot of early Mormons were Masons. Masonry has a very interesting and fascinating history, and I think that there's a lot of utility in comparing the early endowment ceremony to contemporary Masonic exposés, because the only writings that we have about the Masonic initiation are from guidebooks that were written and leaked, and from people who went through the initiation and wrote an exposé. And it's very similar in early Mormonism as well. A couple of resources I would recommend would be Increase and Marie Van Dusen. They went through in 1846 through the Nauvoo Temple. This is not through Joseph Smith's endowment, but through Brigham Young's endowment ceremony. Unfortunately, Joseph Smith's endowment is very elusive to history. We can't reconstruct it 100% yet, but their expose of the Nauvoo Temple endowment ceremony is really interesting. There is also an 1867 guidebook of a Masonic, I think it was a York Rite ascendancy, and it wasn't an expose. It was a leaked document or a leaked book that was an instruction booklet. And when you compare the Increase in Marie Van Dusen expose side by side to that 1867 expose, it reads almost word for word in so many respects. So they're very much patterned after each other. As far as Masonry being the vanguards of a cult, I don't know anything about that. As far as Masonry coming from the Knights Templar, no, they didn't. The Knights Templar were a separate organization. As far as the Masons running the world, I have no comment on that because I think it's a fruitless endeavor to study. But any other questions?
Yes. Back to Joseph Smith for a minute. through your studies, have you come upon that basically he came from a family of grifters or gypsy-like individuals where his father and his grandfather, all these guys were looking for ways to make a buck, basically by conniving people, lying to people, and so forth. Have you come upon that in a lot of your studies? It wasn't just Joseph Smith that thought this up.
No. It was he was a product of his time and a product of his family. The whole Smith family line is quite interesting. I think I haven't read it yet, but I would assume that a great source for all of this would be Kathleen Melanakis' book, The Early Evidence of Early Mormon Counterfeiting. I believe that's the book. It was published like 3-4 years ago. But like I said, I haven't read it yet, so I haven't been able to verify it, but I know that she's, some historians have questioned her methodology to a certain extent, but a lot of the information in there is good. And it documents a fair amount of the Smith family, prior to Joseph Smith, coming into the public light, the early Smith families running and dealings with the laws. Notably, Joseph Smith Sr. was in debtor's prison for like 30 days, while Joseph Smith was just a young little guy. And it had something to do with him swindling money from people. There was a whole family tradition of this kind of stuff. It was not just Joseph Smith who was swindling people. He learned it from his dad. His dad probably learned it from his dad. It was a whole family ordeal. It was a whole family endeavor. It was probably all of the kids that were doing it. They were not this pious, they were not this Park City, Mormon, Utah family with a white picket fence and an Infiniti SUV. That's not who the Smiths were. They were vagabonds. They were transients. They very rarely held down jobs. And all of the things, all of the cultural tendencies, all of the social strata issues that come along with being a poor person in the 19th century in America, they suffered from that. They tried to do everything they could to get out of it. Joseph Smith happened to be the one who found the right key to unlocking the higher echelons of society. So the question, the St. George Temple vision of the signers of the Declaration of Independence appearing in a vision, that's one of those things it's just an apocryphal story, right? It's one of those things that was created at a time, just like the idea of Brigham Young's face transfiguring to look like Joseph Smith in August of 1844 to inherit the mantle. It's one of those stories that was manufactured at a later date to sell a narrative. And that's just one of them. It's just one of not a handful, but one of an ocean full of these fake stories that were created later. Yeah. Oh, I'm sure that people still believe it. Yeah, we know that it's false. We know that it was fabricated. Just like we know the first vision was fabricated. I think there are probably still a lot of people who believe that it happened. Yep. And the three Nephites. Hey, my great-great-great-grandpa was converted by one of the three Nephites. Thank you very much. I can tell that story at some point if you guys would like. I wish I knew. He didn't tell me. Yeah, so one final question. We have time for one more. Pass it like a sacrament tray. Only with your right hand. Okay. Hey, no, you pass it with your left hand. Not cool. And this was a question about the newest research that I presented with the group. So, once again, patreon.com/nakedmormonism.
My brother-in-law, who's a good member of the church, came up with this idea that Jesus' line, kinship, was transported over to America, and that Joseph Smith was given to that family so he could start the church. Have you heard anything about that?
Okay, so Joseph Smith was all about like the patrilineal descendancies. That's why he wrote himself as prophesied in the Book of Mormon. That's why he wrote himself as prophesied of in the Book of Moses, because he thought he was literally a Jew descended from Joseph of Egypt. And similarly, the entire idea that we're all sealed together as a family into the eternities, into the great eternal realm, this all comes down to this idea of patrilineal descent straight from Adam all the way to Joseph Smith. And anybody who's sealed to Joseph Smith is sealed into that eternal family. And anybody who has been sealed in the temple today, you are a part of that family. You're a part of Joseph Smith's family. So, yeah, yes, yeah, a little Tiger Woods fist bump there, yeah. It's all insane, right? But it does tap into this idea that like magic powers transfer apparently through penises only through sons to sons to sons to sons, and they're the ones who hold the mantle, who hold the control of everything, and Joseph Smith was the next guy to hold that. Did that answer your question-ish? Okay.
Thank you, Bryce. I learned quite a bit today, so appreciate that. Okay, we invite you to stay afterwards. We have refreshments. I'm going to, yeah. Next month? I am. Oh. Yeah. Okay, on next month, on Sunday, May the 12th, we will have Christine Jepson Clark and her husband, David. She was interviewed by John DeLynn about 5 years ago. And John has told me that this is his most downloaded podcast of all of his podcasts. So you won't want to miss this. Christine is the mother of 6 children, a former Tabernacle Choir member, and Christine's father was General Authority Malcolm Jepson, a very close friend to Boyd K. Packer. In fact, he was Boyd K. Packer's physician. Christine's husband, David, was bishop for 8 years and in a stake presidency. So they got quite the story to tell. They'll be next month. And next month will be our last month because we take a summer vacation and then we come back in September for another new list of great speakers, which I won't reveal right now because I don't have them all in place yet. So thank you very much. We'll see you next month on the 12th.
All right, that's going to do it for our presentation and for our episode today. Once again, I want to thank Wayne Hepworth as well as all of the people that came to meet up at this Southern Utah Mormon-ish support group. Now, they do monthly meetings. They take a break during the summer. And as you heard Wayne announce at the very end of this presentation, there's they have a really interesting upcoming talk that is going to be for May, and then they take June, July, August off. But every month, other than those 3 months, they have fantastic presentations by fantastic people, and they also do weekly meetups at the local Smiths in St. George, where they just have like a coffee hangout with everybody. So if you're looking for a support group, and you happen to be in the southern or southwestern portion of Utah, this is a really good group to get started. And it really does provide that sense of community that a lot of us leave behind when we leave the church. And of course, you're going to find a link to their group in the show notes. But with all of that, let's go ahead and thank our newest patrons. We really had quite a few people step up to the plate here. So first, I want to thank Tyson, Leslie, Karen, Doc Bob, who I met at the actual meetup, and pledge edits by Larry, by Aunt Anna, and a pledge edit by Dina. So to all of our new pledges and our pledge edits over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism, thank you so much for pledging to support the show and, financing this research. It does take a lot of time to compile this, and you guys are all helping me to do that. So thank you so very much. Just a little heads up for what is in the future, a little forecast for the show. Next week is going to be a regular timeline episode. But the week after that, so in 2 weeks from when this airs, I'm actually going to present to all of you the interviews that I'm going to be doing at Sunstone in Short Creek. Now, Sunstone Short Creek is coming up. That is going to be on April 26th. It is on Friday. However, it does go for 3 days. It's the entire weekend of the last weekend of April 2019. So if you're in the southern Utah area and you're able to make it to Short Creek, it would be really awesome to see you there. If not, then, consider going to any of the Sunstones. They have, the main Sunstone that's going to be happening in the last weekend of July this year into the first week of August. That's always the big Sunstone that's going to be at Mountain America Expo Center, but they have these little satellite meetups in Kirtland, in Seattle, in San Diego, and even some over in Europe overseas. So Sunstone is really an amazing organization, and Lindsay has done a lot to really turn this organization around. And it does provide that big Mormon con type of experience that we can all get together and have conversations about the church and about our experiences in it and about the culture and the experiences that we all have gone through in the church, as well as church history, which of course is the main reason that I attend. So upcoming in this Sunstone Short Creek, the keynote speaker is going to be D. Michael Quinn. They have a number of other speakers that are going to be presenting. There's also a service project. There's a driving history tour. There's a hike that we're doing through the Narrows. There's just a lot of really cool stuff going on. So if you are able to, you're going to find a link to sunstonemagazine.com in the show notes where you can find the tickets for that and all of the information that you need. And if you're not able to make it this year, maybe try next year or the following year or any time that you want, because Sunstone really is an amazing organization. And I'm kind of sad that I took so long to begin attending, and now every time I am able to attend, it's just a fantastic Mormon con that I love to attend. Also, one final announcement. I did an interview on the Spalding Theory on Mormon Stories podcast. So be checking the Mormon Stories podcast Facebook group for when that airs. And it should be airing, a day or two after this episode airs. And on their regular actual Mormon Stories podcast feed, it should be going up within the next week or two. So be looking out for that. And John was very generous with his time and allowed me to try and kind of lay out the Spalding Theory from top to bottom and all of the evidence for it, as well as where I kind of come down on the Spalding Theory. So it was a really fun conversation, and needless to say, because I'm such an insufferable windbag, John barely fit a word in edgewise, and it was just me basically lecturing on the Spalding Theory. So it's more of what you tune in for every week here, and you're going to find that a link to the Mormon Stories Facebook group in the show notes, and be watching for it. It was a really fun conversation. So with all of that, I'm going to go ahead and sign off for this week. And I want to, of course, thank all of you so much for hanging out with us and for lending me your ear. I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager, Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer, and Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres as legal counsel. Music is provided by Jason Comeau of aloststateofmind.com and used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2018, all rights reserved.